this video on totalitarianism, we will look at case study number 2, Fascist Italy. We'll explore the rise of Mussolini and the characteristics of Italian fascism. Following World War I, in the immediate aftermath, Italy had a democratic system, but the country was beset by many problems. For one, Italy had not gained the irredenta, or land where Italians lived but was outside of the Italian state. They had not received as much land from the settlement after World War I as they had desired. There were still Italians, primarily in the areas formerly held by Austria, but there were still Italians living in territory outside of Italy, and so Italy suffered terribly during World War I, and they did not receive what they thought they had coming to them. Following World War I, there was you found terrible unemployment, high taxes to pay for the war, and you had trade struggling throughout much of the world, but Italy particularly did not flourish. Italy's democracy was still relatively new, and so you had the feuding of political factions. You had people all over the place. You had strong conservative monarchists. You had full-blown communists. You had Fabian socialists. You had Democrats. You had Christian moderates. You had all sorts of factions feuding, and it made forming a government difficult in light of some of these problems. And like so many other countries, Italy had a large war debt following the First World War. Mussolini, where does he come from? What's his story? Mussolini organizes the Fascist Party in Italy following World War I. A translated version of their ideas is to make Italy great again. That idea of risorgimento, or resurrection, that Italy was once vibrant and alive. They have grown weak or nearly died, and they want to come back to their full greatness. Think of the days of the Renaissance. Think of the days of the Roman Empire, where at previous times Italy has been one of the world leaders, and now they are a second-tier power at best. And so his message of bringing back Italian greatness resonates with many people. He earned that name. He took the name fascism from fasces, the term for a group of rods bound together tightly. That would be the image of the country, is to be binding the country together tightly. So rather than a bunch of individuals, you have one tight bound group that together can accomplish more. He speaks about that Roman greatness and ending corruption, that democracy leads to nothing but talk, but he would be a man of action, that there was so much sacrifice in World War I to gain so little, and that under his rule, Italy would gain more of this irredenta, this unredeemed territory outside of Italy, and would become a conquering country. But he's just a guy with a party, and there are many parties. How does he rise quickly? Well, as the leader of his party, he's elected to Parliament in 1921, but his real power comes from the use of a paramilitary group called the Black Shirts. These are people who are fascists. They are members of the Fascist Party, and they have a day job. But by night, they are it's kind of like a club. It's kind of like, the best way to think of it in American terms would be a little bit like, you know, the Scouts crossed with the Klan. The idea that they sort of see themselves as these uniformed do-gooders, but one of the things that they do is political violence and intimidation, if that makes sense. And so these are guys who support him politically, but they're willing to take action with violence or the threat of violence and intimidation in order to promote their party. And he stages the following year this dramatic march on Rome, in which tens of thousands of his uniformed members wearing black shirts march on Rome and demand that the king make Mussolini the prime minister of Italy, even though he's from a minority party. Rather than fearing riots and strikes and revolution and violence of these black shirts, the king gives in, and Mussolini becomes prime minister of Italy, even though he only represented a part of the country. Over time, he becomes known as Il Duce in Italian, the leader, the boss, the chief. And in so doing, he makes fascism the only party and makes the government exceedingly strong, looking only to him, Il Duce, the leader. You do that by censoring the press, by continuing to have elections, but by blatantly rigging them, banning labor unions, even though he had come from origins in a workers' movement and socialism. Labor unions can speak out against the government, and banned them, and then banned all the other parties so that there only were fascists. What does it mean to be a fascist? We already talked about where the root name comes from. The chief characteristics of Italian fascism include: 1, nationalism. Okay, a focus on your ultimate loyalty being to your country. Remember that nationalism can have many positive attributes, but it can have negative attributes. The more you love your country, it can tend to make one put down another's country. And so the more passionately you're in love with your own country, it can tend to make you look down upon or even be aggressive towards other countries. Fascism's characteristics include militarism, this idea that you want action, you desire violence, discipline, war, and the glorification of war, that the military is how things get done. They value economic growth, at least in theory, and there's some of this. There's a very common expression about both fascism and Nazism that it may be strict, it may be harsh, it may be violent. They said at this time, but folks would say yes, but at least the trains run on time. Meaning the idea being that there was discipline, that people listened to rules, people worried about doing their job well. I've heard some study that they don't actually think the trains ran any better under the fascists or not, but that was the perception. Much like with Marie Antoinette, who maybe didn't actually say, let them eat cake, but she would have said it. Maybe the trains didn't run any faster, but they would have under the fascists with that perception of their government discipline and action. Okay, and the government formed an alliance with the business elite, where the state controls corporations with a sort of corporate state. Government would intervene in order to push and encourage or force businesses to increase production. So unlike with Stalin, where they take over and had those 5-year plans, the government demands what will be made, it's kind of this in-between. It's not fully capitalism, market, laissez-faire, where the market and businesses produce what will yield them a great profit. In fascism, you still have the profit motive, you still have independent businesses in the private sector, but they're in alliance with the government. They work closely. Another characteristic of fascism is the ultimate glorification of the state. The government, the state, the leader require one's absolute obedience. Everything is in the state. There is nothing outside of the state, and certainly nothing against the state. People are asked to sacrifice for the state. They would take John F. Kennedy's question of imperative to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, to this ultimate extreme of don't ask for anything, ask how much more you can sacrifice for your country, and demanding that sacrifice. The role of women in the fascist system. They saw in World War I, if you recall, a key strategy was to run the other side out of men, and how a whole generation of young men was slaughtered in World War I. And so every country after this war has a big panic that they need to literally replenish their population. And so even though and there are so few marriage-age men, those men who fought that war, the key group of men fighting and dying and being maimed and wounded in World War I, those were men age 18 to 40, which are prime fathering age men. And so you slaughter that group, and there's this call on men, but women to have families, to raise, have a lot of children, and to raise families in order to have more fascist babies. Now, to conclude, let's look at how we shall compare fascism to two other systems, democracy and communism. Fascism is inherently anti-democratic. You don't have elections, or if you do, you rig them. The idea is the state, the leader. You don't really care to have a vote. Votes make people agitated. They make people disagree with one another. What you want is unity. You don't want a plurality of voices like in democracy. Fascism rejects reason. In theory, a democracy promotes a lot of reason. The idea of public education is very popular in democracy because you need educated citizens. Fascism is very emotional. It's about the passion, about action, and not about a careful, reasoned attitude. They argue that democracy leads to greed, leads to corruption, and democracy has a perverse focus on the individual versus the collective. Fascism, like communism, has a focus on the collective, the group. And finally, to compare fascism to communism, a few differences before we get to some similarities. Some differences. Fascism values the nation over class. In communism, in Stalinist Russia, there's this idea of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, and how you want to destroy the business class and the rich class, and you want a nation of workers and peasants. Contrarily, under fascism, you have nationalism, the nation. It harkens a little bit back to that idea of feudalism, where people have their place. There may be upper class, middle class, lower class people, but we should ignore all that and focus on being good Italians, good fascists. Fascism also focuses on the national as opposed to international. In theory, communism wants to spread across the world. Remember Marx's famous slogan, "Workers of the world unite." Remember that Lenin and especially Leon Trotsky were big international communists. Now, Stalin himself was having communism focus on only Russia. But in theory, communism is always more of an international system versus fascism is more national, all about your country, your state, your people. And again, in fascism, you control the private sector. You're in alliance with the business rather than in communism where you try to destroy it. You can never truly destroy a market system. What you do is you drive it underground, and you have underground black market inflation. But that's often what you have in communism versus in fascism. The state and the private sector work hand in hand. And finally, a few similarities between fascism and communism. They both become popular, and people become desperate. You're willing to try anything. So you turn to the crazies. What have we got to lose? Things are already so bad, like they were after World War I in many countries. Things are so bad, why not give the crazies a chance? Why not look for someone who's a little more extreme? What have we got to lose? Both systems are dictatorial, totalitarian governments, as we've already said, where the government controls all or nearly all aspects of life. Both are examples of one-party rule, where you abolish any other voices. Both relied on a personality cult of the leader, a near worship of Joseph Stalin, a near worship. Next time, we'll talk about Adolf Hitler. And Mussolini never quite got there, but that cult of personality around your leader. And again, the state having absolute power, absolute control. There is no sense of a constitution or rights or things the government can't do. The government will do as it wills, and the government wills as its leader wills. Thanks for watching.